So you've been following the Passionetta Prince case for years,
Yeah.
right? Piecing it together from news reports, court transcripts, even those deep dive online forums.
hmm
But honestly, are we really sure we have the full picture?
Yeah.
We're about to take a deep dive into all the source material you've sent over.
Okay.
And trust me, there are some pretty unsettling details, particularly about a certain pair of bloody jeans that suggest there might be more to this story than we initially thought.
Hmm. Interesting. What's particularly interesting about this case is that it initially looks like a classic domestic violence scenario.
Yeah.
But as you dig deeper, you start to see all the cracks in that narrative.
Oh, okay.
For example, everybody remembers the initial focus on Patrick Baldwin.
Right. Passionetta's on-again, off-again boyfriend.
Exactly. His belongings were found at the crime scene back in February 2006.
Mm-hmm.
He seemed to be acting pretty erratically when he was questioned by the police, and there were even those minor injuries that could have pointed to a struggle. Seems like an open and shut case, right?
Yeah, totally. And don't forget about that men's watch and those bloody jeans that were found at the scene.
Yeah.
It all pointed towards Baldwin. But then there's the DNA evidence, or rather the lack of it. I mean, finding DNA from multiple people under Passionetta's fingernails, including Baldwin, definitely muddied the waters a little bit.
Oh, for sure. This case really illustrates those limitations of DNA evidence, especially in the early days when it was being used in investigations.
Yeah.
Back in 2006, DNA analysis wasn't as advanced as it is today.
Right.
So while the presence of Baldwin's DNA under Passionetta's nails was definitely suggestive,
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't a 100% match. Investigators couldn't say for sure if it got there during a struggle or through everyday contact.
So DNA wasn't the silver bullet everyone initially thought it would be. What happened next? Did the investigation hit a dead end?
Not exactly. Remember Michael Scott?
Yeah, vaguely.
Baldwin actually brought him up as a potential suspect.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Scott was seen with Passionetta at a cast party the night before she was found.
Mm-hmm.
And he even admitted to following her home from the bar. Said he was worried about her safety after seeing her leave alone.
Hold on. He followed her home. That sounds a little more than just concerned friend territory, don't you think?
Yeah, that's what makes this case so fascinating. See, according to Scott, he drove back to Passionetta's house a little later.
Okay.
And he witnessed this confrontation between her and Baldwin.
Oh, wow.
Even more chilling, Scott claims that Baldwin actually later threatened him over the phone,
What?
warning him to stay away from Passionetta.
So now we have two potential suspects, each with their own version of events. Did investigators believe Scott's story?
It's hard to say for certain. The sources you provided don't really reveal much about the investigators' initial reactions.
Okay.
But we know that for a while, the focus shifted back to Baldwin. Investigators uncovered information suggesting that Baldwin was actually financially dependent on Passionetta
Oh, wow.
and that there was a potential history of violence in their relationship.
That definitely adds another layer.
Yeah, it does. It speaks to a crucial aspect of these kinds of investigations. Understanding the dynamics of the relationship between the victim and the suspect.
Yeah.
The fact that Baldwin relied on Passionetta financially and that there was this potential history of violence suggests a level of control and possessiveness that could have very easily escalated tragically.
Yeah, for sure. This is where it starts to feel like a classic domestic violence case again. Was there any hard evidence connecting Baldwin to the murder at this point, though?
Not yet, but there's a key detail in the phone records. Baldwin calls Passionetta multiple times on the night of her alleged confrontation with Scott. Now remember, Baldwin claimed to be at his sister's hotel that night, right?
Yeah.
So, while the calls to Passionetta, this fueled the suspicion that Baldwin might have been motivated by jealousy and obsession.
Yeah, that's a pretty significant detail. Were investigators able to build a strong case against Baldwin based on this new information?
Not immediately. The case went cold for 3 years, which is unfortunately common in these complex investigations.
Right.
It wasn't until the cold case unit took over that things started to move again.
Okay.
One of the first decisions. They decided to re-examine all the evidence,
Yeah.
including pushing for more extensive DNA testing.
I bet they were glad they did. What did they find?
They hit the jackpot. The new tests revealed a full DNA match for Baldwin on Passionetta's pajama shirt.
Wow.
Finally, a concrete piece of physical evidence that placed him at the scene of the crime. This was a huge breakthrough for the prosecution.
So what happened to Baldwin after the DNA match came back? Did he finally confess?
No, he never confessed outright.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
And it speaks to a key takeaway for anyone who's interested in true crime. Baldwin actually gave two very lengthy statements to the police during the initial investigation and later when he was brought in again. He was very insistent on talking, despite being advised of his right to remain silent.
Why would he do that if he was guilty? Wouldn't he want to avoid incriminating himself?
This happens more often than you think. See, Baldwin was likely trying to control the narrative, believing he could outsmart the police with his words.
Oh, I see.
But in his desperation to explain things away, he ended up revealing these crucial details and inconsistencies that ultimately helped to seal his fate.
Wait, so you're saying Baldwin's own words were used against him even though he never actually confessed?
Exactly. This case highlights the power of language, both spoken and written,
Yeah.
in criminal investigations.
Yeah.
Even seemingly harmless statements can be carefully analyzed, dissected, and ultimately used to build a very compelling case against a suspect. It's like putting together a puzzle
Yeah.
where each word, each pause, each contradiction becomes a piece that fits into a larger picture.
Okay, I'm definitely starting to see how this seemingly straightforward case got so complicated. So the prosecution had the DNA evidence, they had these incriminating statements from Baldwin. Was that enough to convince the jury?
You'd think so, but the defense still had a few tricks up their sleeve.
Oh.
They clung to Baldwin's alibi that he was at his sister's hotel room on the night of the murder.
Right.
Seemed pretty solid at first, until it wasn't.
Oh no, what happened? Did his sister turn on him?
In a way, yes.
Hmm.
During the trial, his sister changed her story,
What?
admitting that she had actually lent Baldwin her car that night.
Oh, wow.
While she still maintained that he was at the hotel for most of the evening, she acknowledged that he had left for several hours.
Oh,
Conveniently, during the time frame when Passionetta was most likely killed.
wow, talk about a plot twist. So, with his alibi falling apart, what was Baldwin's defense? Did he try to pin the blame on Michael Scott?
That's coming up in part 2 of our deep dive.
Okay.
But before we move on, let's pause here for a second and consider what we've learned so far. We started with what seemed to be a classic domestic violence case, but quickly uncovered all these layers of complexity. The limitations of early DNA testing, the power of a suspect's own words, the significance of a seemingly solid alibi crumbling under scrutiny. It's a reminder that the truth is often elusive and that the pursuit of justice is rarely a straight line.
Absolutely. And what about those bloody jeans found at the crime scene? Were they ever linked to anyone?
That, my friend, is the big question.
Oh, okay.
And one that we'll be exploring further in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, sounds good.
Stay tuned.
Okay, so we left off with Baldwin's alibi basically in shambles.
Yeah.
And those mysterious bloody jeans still unaccounted for.
Right.
Did the defense try to shift the blame onto Michael Scott?
They did. They remembered that Scott admitted to following Passionetta home and witnessing that argument between her and Baldwin.
Right.
So the defense tried to use this to create that reasonable doubt, suggesting that maybe it was Scott and not Baldwin who became violent that night. They painted Scott as this potential stalker, obsessed with Passionetta and just enraged by her rejection.
It sounds like a classic defense tactic. When the evidence against your client is strong, you just point the finger at somebody else. Did the jury buy it?
Well, the prosecution was ready for that. They called Scott to the stand,
Oh, wow.
allowing him to tell his story directly to the jury. His testimony, along with some corroborating evidence, ultimately weakened the defense's attempt to portray him as a jealous stalker.
So that was a bold move by the prosecution. It seems a little risky to put someone who could be seen as an alternate suspect on the stand.
It was a calculated risk, for sure,
Yeah.
but it seems to have paid off.
Yeah.
By calling Scott to testify, the prosecution was able to control the narrative and address any of those lingering doubts that the jury might have had about his involvement.
Right. They took away the defense's ability to spin a story around him. What about the landlord?
Yeah.
The one who had that brief relationship with Passionetta. Did they try to implicate him as well?
They did. The defense brought up this past relationship, attempting to portray Passionetta as someone who had maybe angered or alienated multiple men.
Right.
However, the prosecution again countered this tactic by calling the landlord to the stand.
Smart.
His testimony didn't really support the defense's narrative at all, and it likely backfired by highlighting Passionetta's character as this really kind and friendly person.
So the defense's attempts to shift blame seem to have completely fallen flat. What about Passionetta herself?
Yeah.
How was she portrayed during the trial?
This is where the human element of this story really shines through. Remember Passionetta's stepson?
Mm-hmm.
He had some legal troubles in the past, and the defense tried to use that to their advantage. but when he took the stand, it was a powerful moment.
What made his testimony so powerful?
Despite being considered a tough guy, he became visibly emotional when he was talking about Passionetta. He spoke about her kindness, her generosity, and the love that she had for her sons. He completely denied the defense's insinuations and just defended her character fiercely.
That must have resonated with the jury to see this tough guy break down talking about her.
It did. His testimony humanized Passionetta and reminded everyone that she wasn't just a victim in a legal case. She was a real person who is deeply loved and is greatly missed.
It's a stark reminder of the ripple effects of these types of tragedies. They don't just impact the victim and the perpetrator. They leave this trail of heartbreak and loss that affects so many lives.
For sure. And it's something we often forget when we get caught up in those legal details of the case. Passionetta was a mother, a daughter, a friend, a talented actress with a bright future ahead of her. Her loss was felt deeply by her community, especially her sons.
Okay, let's get back to the trial. The prosecution had the DNA evidence, the incriminating statements, a crumbling alibi. Did the defense present any other arguments?
They tried to poke holes in the prosecution's timeline, suggesting that the estimated time of death was unreliable and that there wasn't really enough evidence to prove that Baldwin was at Passionetta's house at the exact moment she was killed. However, the prosecution's presentation of the evidence, combined with those really compelling testimonies from the witnesses, ultimately convinced the jury.
So what was the verdict?
Patrick Baldwin was found guilty of second-degree murder.
Second degree. What's the distinction between that and first-degree murder?
In this case, the prosecution argued for first-degree murder, which implies premeditation.
Right.
They pointed to the brutality of the crime,
Right.
the use of the air compressor hose as a weapon, and the fact that Baldwin had called Passionetta repeatedly that night, suggesting he might have gone over to her house with the intent to harm her.
Okay, but the jury didn't agree.
Right. The jury ultimately concluded that while Baldwin was responsible for Passionetta's death, they couldn't definitively prove that he planned to murder her in advance.
Okay.
This is what led to the second-degree murder conviction, which recognizes that intentional act of killing, but without premeditation.
Yeah, that must have been a difficult distinction for the jury to make. What about Baldwin's reaction to the verdict? Did he show any remorse?
There's one final detail that's pretty striking. Since his conviction, Baldwin has made no attempt to contact authorities or appeal his sentence. It's as if he's just accepted his fate.
That's a chilling thought. It makes you wonder what's going on in his mind. Does he feel any guilt for what he did, or is he just resigned to the fact that he's going to spend the rest of his life behind bars?
We can only speculate, of course.
Yeah.
But it really speaks to the complexity of human nature. The fact that even after a trial and a conviction, there's still so many unanswered questions, unresolved emotions.
That's the thing about these cases, isn't it? They're never really truly closed.
Right.
There's always something more to uncover, some piece of the puzzle that just remains elusive.
Exactly. And in this case, that missing piece might just be those bloody jeans.
Right.
We'll revisit that mystery, and we'll discuss what it might mean for our understanding of this case in the final part of our deep dive.
All right, so we've covered a lot in this deep dive. We've looked at the evidence, the trial, and of course, the lingering questions surrounding Passionetta Prince's murder.
Right.
But there's this one piece of the puzzle we keep coming back to.
Yeah.
Those bloody jeans found at the crime scene. What happened to them? Were they ever linked to anyone?
It's fascinating, isn't it? You'd think with a piece of evidence potentially that crucial, it would have been a major focus of the investigation.
Right, exactly.
But the sources you shared are oddly silent on the whole matter.
Mm-hmm.
There's no mention of who the genes belonged to or if they were even tested for DNA. It's like they vanished from the story.
Yeah, it's almost like this ghost in the machine, a clue that seems super important and completely irrelevant at the same time. It makes you wonder if there's this whole other story we're not seeing.
Yeah.
Like this shadow narrative that runs alongside the official account of what happened.
That's interesting. What's particularly intriguing is how the disappearance of those genes from the story coincides with the strengthening of the case against Baldwin. Once they got the DNA match on the pajama shirt and his alibi fell apart, the focus really shifted entirely to him. It's possible the investigators and even the prosecution just deemed the genes less relevant as the case progressed.
That makes sense. I mean, if they felt like they had enough evidence to get a conviction without the genes, why risk introducing another element that could complicate things,
Yeah. Sometimes in these legal proceedings, less is more.
Right.
But from like a purely inquisitive standpoint, that gap in the narrative is incredibly tantalizing. It reminds us that even in cases that seem solved, There can be these loose ends, unanswered questions, alternate interpretations of the evidence.
So where does that leave us then, just with this sense of unease, the suspicion that there might be more to the story than we know?
Perhaps. But it's also a really good opportunity to think differently. Instead of just accepting the official narrative, we're invited to speculate, to consider those alternate possibilities and ask ourselves, what if? What if those genes belong to someone we haven't even considered?
Yeah.
What if they point to a completely different sequence of events that night?
Right. It's a good reminder that truth, especially in cases like this, is often about perspective, interpretation. We're relying on the information that's been made available, but we can't discount the possibility that there are still some pieces of the puzzle hidden away.
Yeah, that's the beauty of true crime. It challenges us to be critical thinkers, to question assumptions, and to acknowledge that even with a conviction, the search for a complete understanding of what happened can continue.
So, where does this leave us? What's the takeaway for someone who's followed this case, analyzed all these details, and is still left with this unsettling feeling of incompleteness?
I think the most important lesson here is to embrace the ambiguity.
Hmm.
In real life, unlike fiction, there are rarely neat resolutions, satisfying explanations, perfect closure.
Right.
The Passionetta Prince case, despite the conviction, remains a story with gaps, shadows, and lingering questions. And maybe that's okay.
Yeah, maybe it's those unanswered questions, those unresolved threads, that actually provide the most compelling reasons to keep searching, keep learning, keep engaging with the world around us.
Absolutely. Because ultimately, that's what this deep dive is all about, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about finding answers. It's about embracing the journey, the thrill of discovery, that humbling realization that there's always more to uncover, more to understand, more to learn.
So well said. For those of you listening, we leave you with this. The case may be closed, but the conversation keeps going. Keep digging, keep questioning, and keep searching for your own truth. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the murder of Passionetta Prince.